It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hey, Irwin.
Now, I've liked this guy that we have on our show as our guest for a while. We've met in a variety of ways.
I was curious. How did you meet? And before we disclose his name.
Before we disclose it, we like a build-up, Tim. This is entertainment value here. I met Tim Ferguson, really, I think on a couple of East Hampton Trails Preservation Society hikes, and his wife, Danielle, his better half, I might add. And we just, he just was an interesting guy. And as I learned a little bit more about him, I actually courted Tim, and he actually led an event for us in Bridgehampton over the summer.
Fantastic.
Regarding the 50-year anniversary of Bridgehampton Commons, which is an article Tim wrote and is in his blog on his website, which is timwferguson.com. And it's also, as a matter of fact, the subject of the next Our Hamptons podcast, the first episode of season 2.
Yes.
So anyway, that's how Tim and I first met. So without further ado, let me introduce to our audience, Tim Ferguson. Welcome.
Thank you, Irwin. And let me say you're our favorite hike leader because you move at a brisk pace.
That's so true.
Yes. I frequently during these hikes get reprimanded and yelled at to slow down. But that's sort of my badge of honor that I haven't lost it yet. So now, Tim, you've, and by the way, Esperanza, this guy's had a really wonderful career. I mean, he's worked, he's written for Forbes, he's written for the Wall Street Journal, and it's fascinating. And the topics, I mean, hey, Esperanza, what's that word for a collection of art? An oeuvre? What is that? Tim's oeuvre is really very impressive. Now, of course, this episode is not our oeuvre, it is Our Hamptons. So we're going to focus on the writing he's written about on Eastern Long Island. But truthfully, and when you visit, when our audience visits Tim's website, I mean, he writes about domestic issues, international. I mean, just really fascinating stuff. I've read some of those, even outside of the Hamptons, but it is the East End of Long Island that we're really focused on. And, I was struck by something you wrote, Tim, especially, talking about Bridgehampton Commons, Halt The Highway, how this land, especially circa 1972, which is an era that really fascinates Esperanza and I, sort of the precursor to what we now know as the Hamptons, mid-70s, early 80s. How you wrote how this land was enjoyed by a precious few. Like, what did your research tell you in terms of how different it was in that era, Tim?
Well, I think anyone coming from New York City, as I did, has to learn the fact that the eastern end of Long Island was not settled from the west. It was settled from New England to a great extent, and others coming by boat. Mm-hmm. So it had a distinct character that was maintained, I think, really through at least the mid-1900s and into the 1960s and such. A sense of isolation, the Bonnickers, the farmers, the other pioneering families and such. And it was only beginning to be disturbed, the summer colonies, obviously, and the railroad had come out in the early 1900s. But for the most part, life on the East End was an isolated affair until about the mid-1960s, and that's when my interest in this history begins.
I see. Now, a similar chord was struck, also when you were talking about farmland preservation, because, and this is a topic Esperanza and I have always, it's been a recurrent theme. You mentioned the summer colonies. We've referred to them here as the bookends of East Hampton and Southampton. Those summer colonies, they've been here for a while, but really the lands between them, Watermill, Bridgehampton, Sagaponack, Wainscott, it was farmland. And, north of the highway was, we had everything there. We had a racetrack that we did an episode on when there was racing in Bridgehampton. It was just so different. But then subdivisions took out the farmland. And when you were researching this, what was that telling you? Like, just the pressures of the development pushing out the farmers.
Yeah, the economic shift. Exactly. Yeah.
It was a changing period, and even within that period, things changed in the 60s and to a great extent the 70s. The apprehension among some of the old timers was that there was going to be a sort of suburban rush into at least Southampton and Bridgehampton, and this was because the central part of Long Island was booming in the aerospace era and such, and this was within commuting distance to those mid-island jobs. Mm-hmm. So you saw a lot of smaller tract homes and such begin to be built, but very different from the situation we're facing today.
Yes.
So that
no, they're larger tract homes now.
and others replacing the smaller tract homes, yes. But so that was the beginning of it. We bought in Watermill North in 2011. Till that time, I had, like most Hamptons visitors, spent my time south of the highway and the beaches and such. And it was only when we bought and I began to look at what was happening around us that I got interested in that other part of the Hamptons, the woodlands especially, and to some extent the farmlands and the bays. And that was where the action was in this period we're talking about, 70s, 80s, 90s. That's where the bulk of the great change was happening.
Right. The displacement of the farmers, the subdivisions, and everything else. And the precursor to that, which is something else you've written about, the Halt the Highway movement, where to your point of earlier, the suburbanization, the fear of the suburbanization.
Although some people embraced it, right? There were plenty of locals that would actually have embraced that.
Indeed, there was a lot of support for that. This is how I got into this project, actually. A mutual friend set up a lunch at the Candy Kitchen in Bridgehampton with Don Lockheim, whose family owned the Southampton Press. His son by then was the publisher, but Don was mayor of Sagaponack. And he was an old foreign correspondent, and the purpose of the lunch really was to talk about his days in Paris and such for the Washington Post. But soon enough, we got to talking about his early days with the Southampton Press, and one of the controversies from those days was this highway, this 4-lane highway that was going to be built. And it, as I discovered, was about 200 yards from my home.
Imagine.
Wow.
So this was a fascinating, eye-opening kind of introduction to what was happening that time. So my research started on that, and it went from there.
Yeah.
You remind me, because I always remember we used to travel a great deal, and my father, who is sort of that generation that would have embraced, sort of like a Robert Moses generation, right? And I remember every time we'd get to that point in Manorville where the high, where that cuts off and you have to go back onto Sunrise or whatever, it's like, he's like, they should have just continued this. Why did they stop this? Right. We need a 4-lane, like he was all for it, and not even thinking, obviously, he could never have predicted what this would look like now,
Exactly. And, Tim actually wrote a great piece on this, Halt the Highway, which is, we're such Tim Ferguson fans, Esperanza, that we have a second podcast coming down the road inspired by that Tim Ferguson article, amongst others, about the whole Halt the Highway. And we had a very powerful East Hampton resident, Tom Toomey, lawyer, library president, and he was really the voice of opposition during that time, according to Tim's research. And it was fascinating because, and to your point, while there were people like your dad who wanted it, there were other people, maybe some of the more realistic farmers, but people of that mindset, maybe the time has come. People are coming out here. And so it really was a conundrum, Tim, I would think, right, during that era. It ultimately didn't happen. But your article that you wrote was almost inferring maybe it should have.
Yeah.
Well, I
That's the
certainly
question.
started with the notion, like most people have these days, that that would have been a horrible prospect, especially near as it was to where I ended up buying a home. But you know, now our streets are full of trade traffic. These are residential streets full of trade traffic and other sort of back and forth vehicles, heavy, noisy, speeding. And they found a way. You know, the highway was never built, but they found a way to snake their path through the west and east through the Hamptons, and maybe that highway would have not been such a bad idea after all.
Yeah. It's the answer to the question we will never know.
Yeah, it's also that old Yogi Berra-ism. It's so crowded, nobody goes there anymore. You
Well,
know,
that's true.
it's just I guess it was sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I think that's still how a lot of us look at it out here. As busy as it's gotten all year, this is still primarily madness in the summer and somewhat tolerable much of the year, except for the trades people that are coming. You know, that does create, that's 12-month a year traffic.
Yes, and that's directly related to the size of the homes, which I know is another.
It's the next, that's the next topic.
Oh,
right?
we are. Don't worry, Tim. We're going there.
We're going there. There's no doubt.
Get there, but you know, you did mention, and now Tim sort of teased us with this, Esperanza, because we really don't know what he's going to say here. But there was a Southampton figure that Tim referred from 1967 to 2000. And I'm using Tim's words now, who epitomizes the lost history of this period, instrumental in land use decisions, yet not memorialized anywhere. All right, Tim, suspense is killing us, okay?
Okay, here's your test.
Okay.
And it's a little unfair because I know you're both East Hamptonites. Do you remember the name Roy Wines Jr.?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, you score.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had to learn about Roy Wines Jr., who was a seminal figure in this era in Southampton. He joined the Southampton Zoning Board in 1964. His family had a plumbing contractor business. And for the next almost 30 years, both in Southampton Village and in Southampton Town, he occupied prominent positions, mayor of the village ultimately, but most important for my study in Southampton Town, he was on the planning board for 25 years, 18 years as its chairman.
Wow.
There is no one more instrumental in what developed or did not develop in Southampton during those years than Roy Wines Jr.
Well, it's interesting because I always have noted how different Southampton feels from East Hampton. And so that would be maybe a testament to Mr. Wines.
He was certainly a boogeyman in the view of a lot of preservationists. The group for the East End and such was frequently fighting him. But like most interesting figures, there's a lot of nuance. Roy Wines was a sort of driver of the clustering of housing developments on the farmland particularly and in the woodlands in order to preserve open space on the remaining part of the property. He was indeed, he was a pragmatist. He was the guy who essentially put together the approval for the expansion of Bridgehampton Commons in the mid-1980s as chairman of the Planning Commission. He later was on the board of the Platonic Land Trust. So there's quite a range in his background. Unfortunately, died really prematurely in 1996, I believe, in his early 60s. But the fact that you have to really plumb the newspaper clippings of the era to learn about Roy Wines Jr. is an example of how this seminal history of the Hamptons is not easy to come across.
Yeah. Esperanza and I have actually talked about that because, again, as we mentioned to you, that particular era, because for us, we're not talking 1940s, 50s, which were way before our time. It was within our lifetimes, and it always fascinated me. I always go back how I came out here in 1989, and I remember from 1989 to 1999, if I tried to resell my house, I wouldn't have gotten a dime more than I paid for it. It was a very stable, steady. And then after 2000, it really started to take off, and we're not even discussing the madness of current day. But so that particular era, like I almost call it the undiscovered time of the Hamptons. My parents bought a house in the Pocono Mountains until my father's dying days said, I didn't even know it existed. And it was to his lament, he kicked himself to the very end. He didn't even know this was out here. We were from Queens. What did we know? But
it was a blessed, beautiful area, as you quoted me, enjoyed by a relative few.
Exactly. I mean, that's
still is, but now the relative few tend to have multi-millions.
Right. And yeah, and we've and if you've been listening to our episodes, we've gone into depth and detail on that.
Or is it that they're just more multimillionaires? I wonder.
Yeah, and then again, with since you can't even buy a house under $1 million anymore, I guess this is the entire community.
We're all multimillionaires.
Yeah, all of us. It's not, millionaire just doesn't have the cachet it once did, Esperanza. I don't think, right?
Definitely not.
Tim, your piece about On the Trails of Hamptons Preservation. Now, Tim is, by the way, Esperanza is the treasurer of Southampton Trails Preservation Society. I'm the president of East Hampton Trails Preservation Society. So obviously it resonates with me. Here's another word for you, Tim, that Our Hamptons uses a lot. We're like-minded. And I liked your last paragraph in this article, in particular, and I'd like you to elaborate on it, how whenever things have gotten too hot in the Hamptons, a countervailing push for preservation has managed to keep much open space for the locals. Volunteer organizations such as trail societies have been vital in maintaining those retreats, and no history of the area is complete without their piece of it. What did your research tell you when you were looking into this?
There has not been an uninterrupted boom in the Hamptons, even during this period that we're talking about, largely in corresponding to the economic cycle, the financial cycle, really, of New York City. There were periods of downturn in the 70s, early 80s, even the early 90s. And during those times, you actually didn't get as much preservation activity because people weren't threatened by the sound of the hammers and the bulldozers. It's only during those boom periods that you really get a response. I mean, the trails, we romanticize the trails, and they are beautiful, but the fact is that only a sliver of Hamptonites make use of those trails. That's a good thing, because you can get out and enjoy nature on your own. Yes. But in fact, the trails and the other sort of beautiful spots were preserved when the neighbors essentially felt the push around them. And that's what I mean by preservation kind of happening during the hot spots.
Yeah.
The epitome of this, I think, in my study was in Montauk in the 1980s. So much of Montauk, north of the highway, had been sort of the woodland playground of locals for years, in the bays and such. And it was only during that period that the development really pushed in there. There were plans for hundreds, thousands of homes in the hills, in what we call Hither Woods today.
Mm-hmm.
That was ground zero of that fight. And that was a classic example of how the citizenry really was bestirred to preserve those areas.
We go back, and when I think about these things, talking about Hither Woods, we've had the history of when Ben Heller wanted to develop Barcelona Point, 341 pristine acres with condominiums and everything else. We even spoke of, Esperanza and I did an episode on the Bell Estate in Amagansett, where the plans for those originally were, just unbelievable. So as much pressure as there has been here, I mean, I think all of these organizations, and particularly visionaries John V. N. Klein, the Suffolk County executive of, the earlier era, Lee Koppelman. This place would be so different without what they did to sort of protect and prevent a lot of this. And yes, people like the Trails organizations has certainly helped as well. We're going to have to start moving into a little bit more present day, though, Tim. And Esperanza, I really enjoyed Tim's piece because is this ever a pet peeve of Our Hamptons podcast that Esperanza and I have talked about numerous times. Tim wrote a piece, how the Hamptons has a new favorite tree. And Esperanza and I have often talked about this. Esperanza is very active with Wainscott Heritage Project, and Wainscott South in particular, just gorgeous expanses of farm fields that are just being, this is code, Tim.
Yeah, we do a little.
And how we often marvel at how people will buy, and we spoke about this actually on the walk Tim and I did with East Hampton Trails, how people will buy and pay a premium really to buy land adjacent to farmland and then screen it. And not only are they screening themselves out, they're screening vistas and view sheds for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, this has been, it's a pet peeve of ours because I grew up in, everything was open space. You could go into your neighbor's backyard. I mean, nobody really cared. And nowadays, that's not the case. Everyone has a fence, everyone has hedges, everyone is, closed off. And your article, which is about the green giants, is exactly, it's like, if I see this little row of soldiers one more time, wherever I go, I'm going, it's like my head's going to explode. Because you have, like Irwin has just referred to, these beautiful farm vistas that are being completely, and by the way, a lot of them have scenic easements. So they've been illegally blocked off with these giant arborvitae hedges that are like 30 feet tall. And we're all shocked that there's not some kind of code language that will address that.
It's a striking lack of imagination on the part of people who could easily afford to indulge some imagination.
Yes, for sure.
And to Irwin's point, sometimes by good design, you don't need to put up a screen around your estate.
Exactly.
Well, it's sort of like you build the humongous, this is what I always think, you build the humongous house or the big flashy house, but then, and it's like, look at me, but then you cover it up.
Exactly.
Or I don't know if it's like, because there's this paranoia or neuroses that people have of, security. And so they build these luxury houses, but then they feel like they need to incarcerate themselves in them because of like some kind of security matter. And it's like, well, if you built a modest, regular home, maybe the robbers wouldn't want to go into your house.
That's very funny, and potentially true. But Tim, and we're not going to romanticize the past here, even though we do, but we're going to try not to really romanticize the past. But we've all read those old Dan's Papers articles of how Dan used to be able to be on Main Street in Bridgehampton and or Montauk Highway in Sagaponack and see the ocean because it was just so flat. So it's not the point, and that's one of the big takeaways of your piece on the favorite tree. It's not just the screening element of the housing; it's how it's completely altered the landscape
and the light, by the way,
and the light
has changed the light. I mean, you know how artists have always come out here for the light, but in fact, that blockage of how that light reflects off the bodies of water, I think that's changed the light.
Well, the fact is that most of these McMansions are being built on spec, and they sell to a sort of cookie cutter market. So far, anyway, and I suppose to that extent, we can't really expect anything different until the codes are adjusted. In Southampton right now, we're in the early stages of a fight over the clearing requirements. If you're not building over an aquifer, essentially it's Katie bar the door on the clearing of beautiful old trees on these properties. So that's probably going to change. That's another example of sort of the fight back, the push and the push back. The cycles keep repeating themselves. We just get a little more crowded and a little less light and view shed each time.
I don't think it would almost be unfair to leave out Tim's quote that summarized this really, I thought, so eloquently, Esperanza, when he said, "For now, just like the McMansions that they frequently surround, the green giants have come to reflect a popular monoculture of abundance and sameness." And I love this. And as of 2021, it is as important to keep up with the Super Joneses as it is not to see them. Yes. And Esperanza, needless to say, an ongoing theme, and I think this is, I mean, we're in season 2 here now, obviously, but that has been such a theme of Our Hamptons. It's just another nail in the coffin of community, in a sense, the screening out to, not see your neighbor, not be part of something, but to seclude yourself away from it.
It's something I have to, as you're talking, Irwin, it's something that has come into my head, and I don't want to sound too drastic, but to me, it sounds almost un-American to do this kind of thing because when you think about it, like the image that Hollywood sells, and I say this as, like as a foreign-born individual who, has talked with people, and they say, in Venezuela, do people really live that way? With the little picket fences right. and everything all open and everything. And I said, it used to be, yes.
Right.
And now it's become, well, no, actually. And so I feel like this has become a place to me that does not feel like the epitome of like the American dream, in my opinion. Like it becomes like, it looks like Venezuela to me. It looks like we're like we're the ones behind bars.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Really? Wow. No, really? I say that really.
Yeah.
And I never understood that. I mean, I think that's how I ended up on the architectural review board, because I was like, why do people want all these fences and gates? Like I lived with that and I don't like it. It's not what I grew up with here. And it's not, as we say in our Hamptons and in the sort of the speak of the preservationists, it's not in keeping,
Exactly. That's I can't add anything to that.
Yeah.
That's no, you said it. That's pretty much does sum it up. Although, boy, that's
it's strong words. I know
it was strong words. I will say that. But hey, it's Our Hamptons. We're allowed to do that, Esperanza.
This is why Tim writes about these things and not me, because I would be yelling at people through the article.
Yes, Tim is very much the diplomat. I'm gonna go along with that. Did you want to add something, Tim?
Well, I just lest we get in the pit of despond here. One of the things I have drawn from my study going back to the mid '60s and such is if you think things are crowded and gauche now, you should have seen what was on the drawing boards in that era, and seriously under consideration. Nuclear power plants in Jamesport,
right.
The bridges from Connecticut, highways hither and yon. The Pine Barrens were either going to be an industrial site or somebody wanted to put an ice skating rink there. One thing after there'd be a dozen golf courses.
Yes,
these things could have happened.
Yeah.
Or how about sewage treatment plants in Heather Hills now?
That's right. That's
that.
Yeah. That's a boy. We could
again. The more things change.
Yeah. Esperanza and I also say Esperanza and I normally often say this: how I've never seen a small town with more issues than this one, but there really, there really are. The Hither Woods, the Wainscott Pit. I mean, it just goes on and on. But we do have to start wrapping up. And to really bring it more into present day, Tim, you're working on something currently. I don't think it's a finished piece yet, but you called it your Hampton Hint piece. And hey, Esperanza, do you know he brought in a name near and dear to us, Jane Maring and Build in Kind. He brought Jane's work in here. So, Tim, why don't we start wrapping up with this? It sort of is a great segue. Hey, Esperanza, Tim did the segue.
He did the segue.
He did the segue because it sort of plays into the whole McMansion thing and how, and this is Jane Maring and Build in Kind's mantra, how most of these new huge structures we see are spec construction, the work of developers. And what's really been interesting is, and Jane has done a great job putting this on her Instagram, they're not just in these very well-to-do, ritzy south of the highway. They're buying 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom houses in modest Springs and Northwest locations, and they're building $4 million houses right there, Tim.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And we won't say it's the last wave, but it's the latest wave that's happening. And it's going to change neighborhoods. I mentioned how the Hamptons has gone through cycles. You want to see what happened in the 70s, you look at the tracks east of Shinnecock Hills Golf Course, where you would expect lavish homes. You see simple tract homes, the ones that are still there, but they're being uprooted.
Yes.
And we're going to have a different neighborhood around that golf course, I assure you.
Mm-hmm.
This is happening. There is a counter push. It's already taken hold in Southold on the North Fork, where we don't spend as much time looking at it as we probably should. But I think what's happening there is a precursor to East Hampton and Southampton. I think you're going to see pushback, and especially if the financial markets continue to go south. I think we're going to see a very different building climate in the next few years.
Esperanza and I have done a few episodes. I'm sorry, Esperanza, did I?
No, I was just going to say one can only hope.
Yes.
I know that's in detriment to many people's livelihoods, but we need to have a vision for the future. It's not just a now thing.
We really do, because it's not just because we have to remember when a developer buys the $600,000 house, the $700,000 house, which is really, starter homes here, they're actually removing that from a potential rental home for a local family. They're removing it from a local family's ability to purchase it. So there's 6 degrees of separation, I think, on all of these issues. Every single one melds into the other. And
they're all connected. Exactly.
All connected.
This whole affordable housing issue.
It's all part and parcel of the same problem. And then we could extend the problem. If there's no affordable housing, there's no tradespeople that can afford to live here. And they're coming from 2 hours away, polluting the air with truck traffic and everything else just to make a living. So there really are a lot of problems. But Tim Ferguson, this was really time well spent, wasn't it, Esperanza?
Yes, I always feel like we could have more time. I wish, it's like the overtime. Could we have overtime with Tim?
Yeah, doesn't Bill Maher do that? Doesn't he have overtime online after his show's over?
Yes, exactly.
Do that.
But why don't we do it out on the hiking trail?
There you go. That's good.
Hey, Esperanza, a live feed.
I'd love it.
All right, we're going to make that happen. To Our Hamptons audience, I implore you, timwferguson.com. This is a really impressive body of work there, not just on local and regional issues, but really international issues. It's just really fantastic and readable. You could really sink your teeth into the work that Tim does. And Tim, we're lucky to have you as part of our community, and we thank you for everything, really, all this work you're putting out for us for the greater good.
Right.
It's fun to watch.
You get it.
And listen.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Tim, thank you. Esperanza, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Irwin. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.